All right, well, welcome. Hello, everybody. This is our special evening program in lieu of the banquet, which we normally would have, but here we are. So I'm Tracy Hames. I'm Executive Director with Wisconsin Wetlands Association. And typically with this event, we hold in conjunction with our annual Wetland Science Conference, but always make it open to the public. It's, usually it's a banquet at a hotel. So we're sad not to be able to get everybody together physically in person. We're happy that we're able to welcome so many people this evening. We had a really good number of folks sign up this year. And so hopefully everybody will come. I think we had over 250 people register so far. So we're so happy that you're here tonight. And it's our tradition at our annual Wetlands banquet to offer a blessing for the meal we are about to eat. So in continuing with that tradition, even though we're not sitting at banquet tables, I'd like to introduce Kathleen Smith from the Kiwani Bay Indian Community and Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission to offer a blessing for this evening. And let me introduce Kathleen. Kathleen is an enrolled member of the Kiwani Bay Indian Community located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. She is presently in a new position in the Division of Biological Services at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission in northern Wisconsin. Her job title in Ojibwe is Ga Guna Wendung Manoomin. Did I trash that, Kathleen?
You did your best.
To she who takes care of the wild rice. Where she implements the GLIFWC Wild Rice Stewardship Plan and works with 11 members tribes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Wild rice is of great cultural significance to its member tribes. GLIFWC focuses on the preservation and enhancement of wild rice in ceded territory lakes. She provides expertise and public information to partners through research, partnerships, and supports tribal members to ensure treaty rights are exercised. She incorporates her traditional and the modern ways of thinking to give a voice to the nations that cannot speak. So Kathy, take it away.
Buju nenwe maganadug wasa no de kwe najinikaz maingin indo dam Anishinaabe kwe inda wekwe dung in Dunjaba. My English name is Kathy Smith, so it is an honor to be invited to this space to speak as a part of the Wisconsin Wetland Association Science Conference. As we come together for the wetlands and the watersheds, in our Anishinaabe way, the wetlands are known as our medicine cabinets. It is of vital importance to our people, as it is our mishkiki, the medicine. All nations had depended on the medicine and the food systems that the wetlands had offered. Our work that is done all come from diverse backgrounds, whether it be tribal, federal, state, private, or academic entities. With that comes great partnerships and collaborations. It includes our stewardship to the waters, the lands, the plant nation, the animal nation, and the relatives that reside in the medicine waters. We all have a responsibility to understand the effects of climate change. What is destroying or degrading wetlands can lead to serious consequences, such as increased flooding, extinction of species, and decline in water quality. We can avoid these consequences by maintaining the valuable wetlands we still have and restoring lost or impaired wetlands where possible for future generations. This work and sharing knowledge joins people of all colors, faiths, and philosophies to work together for life's most precious resource. The wetlands, as it is connected by Nibi, water. As we continue to do this work, we must look upon the youth, college interns, and upcoming biologists that will continue to do this work through mentorship programs, so they can continue the connections to the landscape and sit with the plant and animal nations. Water that connects all things, without it there would be no life at all. Ni miigwitchawendum, ni mishomas and nakomas, GLIFWC Ajayan Nungum, Ni Miigwech Windham, Ni the Kid Nungum, Gi Mijayang, Minom Bimad as the Win, Miigwech Nikita Nongwa Mama Ki, Gi Mijayang, Ni Sewin, Ogi Mijayang Ni Bish, Ogi Mijayang Wisini Yug, Benishi Yug, Manadushug, Minawa Nibishing Ayajig, Miigwech Wabanong, Jawanong, Ipin Gishmuk, Minawa Givoda Nong, Nadamawashin, Miigwech Gije Manadu, Aho.
Thank you, Kathy. And we'll have Kathy back at the end of, after the Q&A session to give some closing comments as well. All right, and now on to the main event. I'd like to thank We Energies Foundation for their support of tonight's session. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Manoomin wild rice is a more than human being from the second order of creation in Ojibwe worldview. Manoomin received her education from the first two orders and from a millennium of practical in-the-field experience. Manoomin will be assisted in this presentation by Peter David, a wildlife biologist with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, who assists GLIFWC member tribes in implementing their off-reservation treaty reserved rights in what is now portions of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. Peter received his education, bachelor's and master's degree in wildlife ecology from UW-Madison, from the tribal elders and members for whom he has worked, and from the Manoomin itself. So, Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tracy. And thank all of you for tuning in tonight. It is very much an honor and very much a pleasure to be here with all of you, although it's really hard to know where here is. It was fun actually to see people sign in and share their locations. I'm coming to you from Odana on the Bad River Indian Reservation up in far northern Wisconsin, which happens to put me between two very special places actually that WWA has worked very hard to help protect. One of those being the Kikagan sloughs and the Manoomin beds along the shores of Lake Superior on the Bad River Reservation. And then to the south of me a little ways are the Benoki Hills and all of the wetlands there that WWA has worked so hard on. So I want to thank you for enhancing my neighborhood up here. It's much appreciated. I gotta say it's a little bit unusual here, but I also am feeling actually quite close to all of you. And it is great to have this opportunity. My life's been a little bit dominated by wolves lately, and tonight kind of makes me feel like it's a chance to revisit with an old friend. Now, this is a banquet, and I hope you're thinking of it as such. Perhaps you're having a little pre-dinner glass of wine and planning a good meal later. I'm certainly trying to look at it that way. I looked hard at the banquet menu options, and I decided in the end that to go with the chicken. I think it's always a good option, but I think really any way you went is probably good too. And I hope you have something equally wonderful to look forward to. So with that, I'm going to jump in here and start doing a little screen sharing. And I hope that's up there. My screen, it's a little actually hard to tell if it's being shared or not, but
looks great, Peter.
All right, thank you much. All right, tonight I'll try to share a few things that I think I maybe have learned over time after I've had this pleasure of working over the course of my career with Manoomin or wild rice. Before I begin, I have to say I've really been fortunate. I've had pretty extensive exposure to two pretty different worldviews over the course of my life and my career. One, of course, being my own cultures and my own upbringing, and the other being this worldview of the Ojibwe, for whom I've worked now for 35 years. I think both of these have influenced me, but tonight, as you will soon see, I will be leaning heavily on the Ojibwe side. And I just want to say to all of the tribal elders and the tribal ricers and individuals who have shared their knowledge with me, miigwech, thank you. It's added greatly to my life and to my family's life. I would also ask for your forgiveness for all the parts that I screw up. The mistakes are totally my own. And incidentally, no, I do not have an evil twin brother, but my brother does. Now, the real guest of honor tonight is Manoomin, or wild rice, particularly this species that we call Zizania palustris, or northern wild rice. And most unfortunately, Ms. Manoomin sends her deep regrets that she cannot be here tonight. This is the time of year that she traditionally takes off to really prepare for all that's going to be expected of her here in the busy months to very soon unfold here. I think maybe partaking of some personal restorative time might be the first lesson she actually has for all of us, but I'm going to try to put those off until a little bit later. I have certainly been honored to be asked to step in for her this evening. I realize that probably leaves a lot of you feeling like you finally scored tickets for that big play in town, only to find out that the understudy is taking over the lead tonight. I can only say that I'll try to do my best. And I want to begin by providing you with a little more background actually on the star herself. It seems like Manoomin has been around forever, with a career actually that spans even more years than Betty White's, and she's still growing strong. You probably know her from many of her past roles. She had a huge supporting role in feeding waterfowl in the Mississippi Flyway here for thousands of years. She was instrumental in influencing the location of Ojibwe reservations here in the Midwest. She has taken literally billions of invertebrates under her leaves to build the food chains that are so critical in our wetlands. And she was certainly critical to establishing the fur trade in this region. But I think to many people, and certainly to the Ojibwe, she was most famous for her role in the Anishinaabe migration story, where she was the food that grows on the water, the being whose presence in the Western Great Lakes region signified that the Ojibwe's journey was coming to an end, that this prophecy that they had to move west until they came to the place where the food grew on the water was fulfilled. And this multi-generational trip was finally over. And they were here and they were home. Now, many of us know that these and other parts of her career, but as is often the case when we look into the lives of the really great ones, people want to know, where did it all start? How did she get to be the being that she is today? And so I want to go back to the beginning. And by that, I really mean the very beginning, and take you with a small introduction to the Ojibwe's creation story. This telling has some parallels to the biblical creation story that I grew up with, at least in the fact that there's a sequence to it. But instead of 7 days, there are 4 orders of creation. And so in a quick, and I would say wholly inadequate summary of that story, but I will try to give some inside perspective on this. But in the first order of creation came the fundamental building blocks: the water, the air, the land, and the fire, essentially in the form of the sun. And when those were in place, it made it possible for the second order of creation. The incredible abundance of all the different plant beings came into the world. That in turn made it possible to support the third order of creation, which, as you probably suspect, was all of the animal beings, the furred, the feathered, the scaled, and all of the other. And there was this perfect community here working together. And then finally, in the last and in the final order, the story tells us came original man. And if original man looks sort of small in this representation here, that's because, in fact, he is. He came last because he had to come last. All of the other parts of creation were doing fine without him. But he was wholly dependent for his survival upon these gifts of these earlier orders of creation. And we're fortunate that the other orders decided to take pity on this humble person and agreed to provide. And so it's certainly appropriate, I think, that we have nights like tonight when we honor those beings that came before us and really make our own existence possible. Now, although Manoomin was just a small part of that second order of creation herself, I've long thought that she sort of symbolizes, at least to me, this perfect fusion of the different orders of creation, okay? She grows here where the water in the earth, in the air all come together, and then is given life by the power of the sun. Now, I am going to beg forgiveness of WWA and all of you and violate a very sound principle of PowerPoint presentations. And I'm going to subject you to a sequence of slides that have a whole bunch of words on them. And in the end, I hope it's justified, but I just wasn't clever enough to figure out a way around this. But in order to make up for that, at least a little bit, I do want to share this first. These pictures have absolutely nothing to do with my talk, but aren't they adorable? So you can keep some of these happy images in your mind as I go through this. But what I really do want to share with you is a quote from the Ojibwe historian Basil Johnston, and his telling about that second order of creation. And then I want to compare that to the writings of another writer who you might be a little bit more familiar with. Then Kiwani made the plant beings. Each he gave a spirit of life, growth, healing, and beauty. Each he placed where it would be most beneficial and lend to the earth the greatest beauty in harmony and order. To me, this is just one of those, wows of passages that you come across. I think it captures a tremendously powerful ecological perspective. And though this story had its origins so very long ago, I think it has so much application today, even when we think about, contemporary issues like invasive species. Now, I mentioned that the two world views I've been exposed to, each of those came with a ecological education as well. Certainly the one from the Ojibwe elders. And the other one for me came before that. When I was working on getting both my bachelor's and master's degrees from the Department of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that program, of course, traces its roots back to a rather well-known fellow named Elda Leopold, who is really considered by many people to be the father of this science of wildlife management. And it was Leopold who penned these lines that you're probably familiar with. That a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. Again, a total wowza statement for sure. Did you notice anything about these two statements? And I'll make it a little bit easier for you and put these actually side by side. And when you do that, you might notice a couple of things. First of all, there's this focus on things being in a proper condition, okay? Harmony and order, integrity and stability. I think these are phrases that are trying to describe the same concept. Nature is not just something that's random, although there's certainly randomness in it. It's not just something that happens to be capable of surviving after we push the landscape in some sort of direction to meet our supposed needs. There are great underpinnings. There are processes and designs that I think we need to understand and live within. And I think that's a very powerful teaching, but I think even more powerful to me is the fact that both of these quotes include the word beauty. Justin even uses it twice. The thing is right, the world is right when beauty is present. I think it's really something. These two people who came from very different cultures, very different upbringings, came to hold that same insight, and an insight that embraces both the science and the aesthetics of the world that we live in. Now, I suspect that the true artists in the room are thinking, duh, right? But as someone who's trained more on the scientific side of all of this, I'm fairly struck by the inclusion of beauty in both of these observations. And so bear with me through just one more wordy slide. But I wondered how much would these quotes have lost without that inclusion of beauty? And I'll let you read those yourself. Personally, I still find these important. I find them strong. But I also find them sort of utterly more forgettable. Okay, the wow factor built into these has kind of disappeared. All right, thank goodness, a slide without words. I want to return back to this Ojibwe worldview and these beings. Well, in that worldview, these beings that came before us are really properly referred to as him or her, not it. And again, not only are they beings, but they are more than human beings for the reasons that I already discussed. And I think if you can adopt that perspective and embrace it even a little bit, I think it really changes the way you see Manoomin and literally almost everything else in nature as well. Okay. Rice now is not just an interesting plant that you might find on particular wetlands or pressed into herbarium sample somewhere. She's not even just something that you may harvest or hunt over or study or steward. Manoomin now sort of becomes this being that has a history. The plants are elders that have experience, they're wisdom holders. And they're beings that are probably, given the past history and a willingness to provide for us human, willing to be teachers to us. So in that perspective, it's sort of natural to reach out to them and to see what they might tell us if we can learn how to listen. I have to say that perspective really lent new meaning to me when I revisited this pictograph that the tribes actually carried when they traveled to Washington, D.C. to petition the United States government for the establishment of permanent reservations. This image depicts the clans of the Ojibwe, okay? And it shows their hearts connected with a common purpose. And it shows their eyes connected with a common vision. And that vision, in turn, was connected with the rice lakes and the rivers that you see in the lower left hand of this figure, okay? These waters were not just an important part of the landscape, okay? They were beings that the Ojibwe were joined to in the same way that they were joined to each other. And I think in a society today that can seem incredibly fractured and incredibly isolated from nature, I think imagine what it would be like to feel that connected to each other and to all of creation. And I will say it gives me hope here tonight because I think that every one of you who tuned in feels something akin to this relationship that's depicted here. So my time is, I'm about halfway through here and I'm really just getting to these lessons, but I still have a couple little caveats to throw out there. One of them is, I guess, an apology. I'm not very good with second languages. I came very close to failing French in high school. After 3.5 decades of working with this plant, I still don't know that I really have tremendous proficiency in Manoomin Moen, or the language of wild rice. But as one of my favorite philosophers, Tom Petty, says, even the losers get lucky sometimes. And I think a few things have managed to seep in despite that. And the only other thing I'd add quickly is that when you do think of Manoomin as a living being, she's not stagnant, right? Like us, she's learning and adapting as we go along. And I have no doubt that in another year or two, she'll have more stories and more understandings that she's willing to share with us. So what are some of the things I do think Manoomin is saying? Well, the first one maybe is just think about what we're doing to those first order beings. You know, in the same way that humans depend on the earlier orders of creation, Manoomin is dependent upon those elements that came in that first order. You know, things tend not to work well for her when we mess up those fundamental components of air and soil and water. You know, increased sulfides and sulfates is one issue we've seen in big parts of Minnesota as a result of mining activity having a huge impact on rice. That's just one example. Climate change is a huge one. You know, I think so far we haven't directly messed up the sun too badly, but it's fairly shocking to me to think that we are kind of fundamentally changing the relationship again that we have with that being. And climate change is likely to be the biggest threat that Manoomin has ever faced, because it really can affect rice across its entire range. You know, you remember that common name, northern wild rice. Well, you know, spoiler alert, but this stuff is adapted to exist in a harsh northern environment. And there's probably a dozen different ways that climate change has a negative impact on wild rice. And we really need to get serious about addressing this. And this clearly, I think, is something that Manoomin is screaming out to us. And I'll show you how I come to that. But, you know, this is an example of the lake in Minnesota. I should have grabbed one from Wisconsin, but I happen to have pretty good camera angles on this one. But over this 11-year period on Dean Lake in Minnesota, which is kind of in the navel, frankly, of the range of Manoomin, there were no less than 5 crop failures. That's a pretty stunning contrast to what was probably the first lesson in TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, that the Ojibwe elders shared with me. And that teaching is often called the 4-year rule. And that is that on average, over a 4-year period of time, you can expect one really good rice crop and probably a couple fair to decent crops, and 1 year that is pretty poor. So something like a 25% failure rate. You know, now here over this 11-year period, we had no less than 5 failures. You know, perhaps that's an anomaly. 11 years isn't a terrible long time, and we will see. But at least 4 of these 5 failures, I'm not really sure what happened in 2011, but at least 4 of the 5, if not all 5, are sort of directly attributable to things very consistent with climate change impacts. Major rainfalls in that, the 7 or 8 or 9-inch storm events, for example. A lot of these other failures are related to heavy outbreaks of a fungal disease that becomes much more prevalent under warm, wet conditions. You know, I think Manoomin here is shouting out a story, along with so many of the other more than human beings that are also sharing that story, in which we are still sort of failing to hear or adequately responding to. I can't say it would have been very fun to be together tonight, but given that we're not, we can at least celebrate all of the miles that we're not driven to make that happen. Now, the other, I think, terribly obvious story that Manoomin tells us is to be generous. Manoomin gives us so much. This is a tremendously giving plant. There's food, there's medicine, there's health, there's community, there's water quality, and of course there's beauty, and there's more. And every year I find out more yet. You know, I am certain I barely understand the smallest amount of the gift of Manoomin. And the amazing thing is, through this tremendous generosity that she has, she draws all of this tremendous abundance and beauty to herself. And that is clearly a lesson she is sharing with us. Another lesson, I think, goes back to this idea that things should have an order and balance. Who knows? I don't know, maybe Manoomin put this idea into Johnston's and Leopold's heads. I don't know much about Johnston, but I know if you go up to the Leopold Center there in Baraboo and are privy to access to Leopold's personal library, he had a box of papers of wild rice in his library, which was a powerful moment for me to experience. Carp are wonderful beings, but we have put them in many places where Kichimanadu never intended. I'd also say that from a distance, this rice bed might look like sort of a healthy early season bed. But if you actually zoom in close to here, you discover that every single stalk in this patch has been heavily browsed by Canada geese. Geese too are wonderful beings. But like carp, I think we have thrown things out of balance, and we need to work to right those things. Another obvious lesson here is of course, persevere. Rice has been through a great deal, but she hangs in there. She has graced this small part of the world, and she's really only found in abundance here in northern Wisconsin and Minnesota and adjacent parts of Canada since the glaciers retreated. Okay, only really now to be facing probably more threats than she ever has at any time in her history. She could call it quits, but she hangs in there and fights and tries to hold on wherever she can. I have no doubt that everybody listening tonight has also had those times when you have grown tired of the fight that seems to be never ending and getting more uphill all the time. But we too have to try to persevere. This one, all I can say is enough said. Good things come to or good things are worth working for. If you think that picking and harvesting rice is a lot of work, you're not going to actually find a whole lot of people who disagree with you. But there's a tremendous beauty in all of that too. And imagine how much work it used to be before we had all of these aids to mechanize steps and simplify things for us. It kind of reminds me of another Ojibwe teaching, you know, about once upon a time, all you had to do to enjoy maple syrup was to snap off a twig and lay on your back and let it drip into your mouth. And the creator didn't like to really see humans getting lazy and unappreciative of this wonderful gift. And so decided you thin that sap way down and make it worth the effort. Like maple syrup, making rice isn't easy, okay, but it was worth it then. And I think it's very much worth it now. She also reminds us, try not to work on an empty stomach. Right? Manoomin is literally one of the best things you can put in your body, higher overall nutrition than any other food that was available to the native diet in this part of the world. Okay, she wants you to enjoy her whenever you can. Incidentally, I used to try to bring this point across by throwing up a data slide that showed all of the vitamins and minerals and protein and wonderful components that are present in rice. And now I just think of what a ninny I was when I could have just shown a nice picture like this. Take care of the ones that take care of us, and know that it's appreciated when you do. There is an older name for wild rice beds, Manatee Gittigan, or the Great Spirit's Garden. And I love that phrase because it captures so much. It reminds us, first of all, that rice provides us with so much more than just her seed. Again, because of all of her generosity, she brings us waterfowl, she brings us fishing, she brings us fur bearers and muskrats and so much more. Okay. So, like your garden, it's not a monotypic stand. It's been referred to as the supermarket, for subsistence foods. All of these different things that are threaded back to their connection with Manoomin. Also, though, like a garden, even though this is a wild crop, it's something that can be tended, and it can be enhanced through some gentle stewardship, in the same way that you enhance your garden. This might seem a little bit contrary, that maybe we're changing the balance of things by meddling with nature, but I think most often these actions that we undertake are really they're efforts to restore balance in a system that's already been tilted out of whack. I have to say, I think there's a certain parallel here also with some of Leopold's language. I was always actually very impressed that the father of wildlife management would describe his own art in his own science in this very understated phrase of intelligent tinkering. Okay. Leopold wasn't trying to reshape the world to make it meet our desires. Okay. He was trying to coax out of it what it was meant to be. And I think that's a perspective that, again, is very consistent with this Ojibwe worldview. And I think in a sort of a related vein of thought, I think that Robin Wall Kimmerer would be very comfortable probably adding the word stewardship here alongside science in her powerful quote about the work that all of you do. Okay. And I'll just say, if you've never had the opportunity to read Braiding Sweetgrass, please do. You'll enjoy it greatly. She's a gift herself. And again, I'll just reiterate that these beings, they may be more than human beings, but they still appreciate when we offer them our responsibility and our attention. And there's so much you do, and your face truly does belong here. Your picture belongs here because of all of the good efforts that you do on behalf of those beings. Now, enjoy and promote beauty. That's a gimme, I guess. But, when you're an ecologist, it can actually be a tough world out there. You see ills and issues and problems in the landscape that most people are oblivious to. Okay. But despite all of those things, there is also great beauty out there. And we need to embrace it. We need to appreciate it and use it to pull us into the right direction and to keep us going. And finally, I'll just say that Manoomin has always been a patient and a subtle teacher with me, and perhaps some of you in the audience are beginning to think that it might be time for me to embrace this particular teaching a little bit, and so I'll just wrap things up here. But I want to say, Miigwech, thank you very much for listening. I want to thank you for the opportunity to spend a little time with an old friend here, and particularly to WWA and for all you do. Putting on a conference in good times is a huge challenge, and doing it under this COVID world we're living in is just a massive undertaking. And you're an incredible organization with incredible accomplishment, and my kudos to you. So with that, I'll bump off here and stop screen sharing, and maybe we can take some questions.
There I am. I'm unmuted now. Katie keeps me muted, and that's probably a good thing as well. So thank you so much, Peter. This was wonderful. Just hearing the simplicity, the simple lessons you've learned over 35 plus years of working alongside Manoomin it's been so enlightening to me. So if anybody has questions, please enter them into the chat and we will relay them to Peter.
The first one is not a question. It just says, wonderful program. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
So Peter, I'll start. Some of the times I've been out and you've come out harvesting with us, and we talked about the subtleties of the rice that you find in different lakes and in different situations. And I was really impressed the day you brought out a whole board with samples of rice seed, and you would talk about the different places and the different colors and textures and et cetera from the different water bodies.
Yeah, it's you know, if the only wild rice you've ever been exposed to is paddy grown wild rice, the domesticated cousin of this stuff, it'll all look and taste sort of consistent. And that's part of what they do. I mean, they dye it to actually look very consistent and all of these kinds of things. Real wild rice has this tremendous variability across the landscape, you know, the seed size, some of the flavor characteristics, and then flavor characteristics that come into it when it's being finished. And so, you know, you can, there's a tremendous variety. So it's sort of like, you know, comparing, you know, McDonald's food to the food from, you know, dozens of different gourmet restaurants. You know, they're just very different products. And if people have never had the real McCoy, the real wild rice, certainly give it a try, because it's a significantly different product than the domesticated stuff that you often find in the stores.
I agree. Okay, here's a question. Peter, do you have any experience with the southern wild rice? Yeah, and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you know, actually very little. You know, the area that I work in at GLIFWC is in the ceded territories, and almost all the rice that we deal with is the northern. I have some familiarity with the southern. You know, it's much more limited in distribution. Where it does pop up tends to be on these river systems, primarily, less so on lakes. And it's an interesting plant because the plant itself is actually bigger and more robust than the northern, but the seed is quite small. And so from a harvesting perspective, it's difficult to harvest the plants. The seed heads anyway will be up above your head, even if you're standing in a canoe. And your return on your effort is actually smaller, but the plant still has tremendous value for wildlife and probably should be managed more than it is. But it's harder to, you know, get things like seed sources for planting the southern variety. So there are some extra challenges in trying to steward that one.
All right. Seems like it is increasing in some areas in the southern part of the state now too.
There are huge beds too once upon a time. I mean, some of the biggest beds that once occurred in Wisconsin were actually in the southern part of the state and were lost. And it's never been totally clear to me how much of those were the northern versus the southern variety.
There are just some gorgeous southern rice beds along the lower Wisconsin River and those back sloughs, all held together by beavers and beaver dams. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Well, okay, next question. We hear about the challenges facing wild rice, climate change, water quality, degradation, etc. Are there any positive trends you've observed in wild rice in the Midwest in recent years?
That's a good question. You know, there are some positives for sure. There's a number of them in a way. One thing I think was that the reaffirmation actually of the tribe's off-reservation treaty rights acted as a catalyst for a lot of rice stewardship to take place. I think it was a resource that was sort of important to a lot of agencies, but typically more on the back burner. And for the tribes, it was really on the front burner. And so it led to a whole lot of cooperative relationships being developed. And we think actually through this cooperative program that involved the state and feds, the Forest Service, local lake associations, county governments, a whole slew of things. I mean, right down to sort of, Boy Scout troops. A lot of restoration work was undertaken. And we think we maybe have increased the abundance of rice by about 20 or 25% in northern Wisconsin. It's getting harder to maintain those kinds of losses. We sort of, our gains, we picked the low-hanging fruit first, and we have more threats now than we did 25 years ago when we sort of started that whole program. But there have been gains, and there have also been just tremendous gains now about the emphasis that's put on rice by agencies, by universities, the amount of research that's taking place. So there's definitely positives out there, but it's worrisome at the same time to look ahead.
Okay. So here's a question. Can a person plant wild rice if they live in southern Wisconsin? What are the implications of planting it maybe a little south of its range?
Well, if you were working really in the south, you'd probably want to plant, you'd probably want to get the southern variety. It's most likely to be successful. And as I said, it's hard to get seed sources for that. So you might actually have to go out and harvest that yourself. There are some other considerations, about where you're planting it and making sure you have the right, habitat characteristics, and also be aware of how you might be affecting other landowners, that kind of thing. But it's certainly legal to plant it. And again, we've lost a lot of the historic abundance of rice, so we should be trying to enhance its abundance.
Okay. Next question, let's see. Can you share more about the locations you work in? Are most of the lands tribal, and or do you work on other protected lands?
Yeah, good question. So at GLIFWC, we have this sort of niche where we assist our member tribes again in the implementation of their off-reservation treaty rights. So I'm actually sitting right now on the Bad River Reservation, but I don't work within the reservation boundaries. I work within the ceded territories, which in Wisconsin is roughly the northern third of the state. And typically we'll work on public lands in those areas, in large part because that's where the tribes have the opportunity to exercise the harvest rights. But anywhere within the ceded territory that we think Manoomin might have a good chance of flourishing, we're happy to try to work cooperatively with other folks to make that happen. And we also extend into parts of east central Minnesota and upper peninsula of Michigan. So it doesn't stop at the Wisconsin line either. Those state lines are Johnny come latelys. The ceded territories came well before the state. So.
All right. Okay, here's a natural history question a little bit. Do you know how wild rice is pollinated, and how many years does it take to reach maturity? The rice, not you.
I vow to be immature my entire life. So it is a wind pollinated plant, but it's interesting because I've been in rice beds that are just buzzed from the sound of bees, but apparently the bees come in and they harvest the pollen and they have no reason to actually visit the female flowers. But it's an annual plant. It comes up entirely from seed each year. So that's why it's resting right now. It's in a seed condition right now, and it'll have to get its whole life cycle done by September. Typically, the end of September, it's all over again. But yeah, it is. It's sort of a bellwether, I think, for climate change that way because it is an annual. It's probably a little more responsive than very long-lived species.
It's vulnerable,
and that's why you have that year-to-year variability in abundance too.
Right. And because it's an annual, it's vulnerable to those big precipitation events if the water rises quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Are there opportunities for in-person wild rice educational experiences in Wisconsin?
Yeah, good question. at times, there certainly are. Some of the tribes have done rice camps, both in Wisconsin and just across the border up at like the Persevere area at some years, and even up almost as far as Kiwani Bay. And GLIFWC at times has worked with partners, usually university partners, to do workshops. We might do something where you get together. A couple of the ones we did were at Tree Haven. We got together on a Friday evening. We made rice harvesting sticks together. We did a ecological overview. The next day, we actually went into a local rice bed and gave people the opportunity to do some harvesting. And then if you're familiar with rice, you know that the rice that you pick actually needs many steps of finishing to be ready for consumption. So we gather up everyone's rice and have it finished and send everybody a couple of pounds later on. But so they're a little bit hit and miss. It doesn't happen every year. But if you look around, and certainly if you express an interest in it, and we get it, it's pretty clear that we sort of have a core group that may be interested in taking this on. It's more likely actually to happen again.
And I thank you for the times you've come out, help us. We've done some harvest field tours in past years, not during COVID, but Peter, you've come out and given us our lessons on rice and on those tours. Okay, next.
It's great being in the field with you.
See a lot of ducks on that as well. I know that GLIFWC has a robust inventory survey of the northern wild rice occurrence. Is there an equivalent inventory for the southern part of the state or across the broader range of its occurrence?
There really isn't for the southern part of the state. I hope, this Wisconsin DNR is actually working on developing a wild rice plan. And I hope that one of the goals of that plan will be to do an inventory. We worked with the state in inventorying the ceded territory, and we think we have a pretty good handle on that. And you can go actually on the GLIFWC's website and find sort of a data layer like that. There is pretty good information from Minnesota. There's not much, at least sort of publicly available information for Michigan, but Michigan also has very, very little rice actually to share.
Okay, speaking of wild rice plans, are there plans for expanding or restoring the number of water bodies in which wild rice thrives?
Yeah, that's just been an active, ongoing program. And so we're always looking for new opportunities. Sometimes, sometimes it's coming into something that's maybe historic range, but not necessarily historic water. So you can have artificial impoundments, for example, can have all of the right habitat characteristics. And really all you have to do is do some seeding to have some success. Other places can be much more challenging. Places that were historic rice beds where the rice disappeared, you obviously have to sort of figure out what led to the loss and address those issues. And oftentimes just throwing seed out isn't the solution. But there's an active program, and if you have locations that you think would be valuable, contact GLIFWC or contact your local natural resource agencies and plant that seed, and I think we would be interested in pursuing them. We have, by the way, a document of sort of seeding guidelines that people could request, and it gives you a summary of what kind of habitat characteristics to look for and all that kind of thing. And we're more than happy to share that.
Yeah, it's a finicky plant. Jim Meeker used to call it the Goldilocks plant, didn't he? It has to be the exact right conditions to flourish.
It's true. It's in some places it's very finicky. It's also really fascinating sometimes when you find a lake map that's 100 years old and you find the rice growing in just about the same place today. So, it's.
Okay, is there any interaction between purple loosestrife and other invasives and wild rice?
Yeah, loosestrife is probably not one that we're most concerned about. But at times, especially if you have sort of major water level changes over time, it can be a concern. We've been concerned about Eurasian water milfoil in some places, curly leaf pondweed. And this is a big battle. A lot of lake associations have invasive problems. They want to do things to treat those problems. We try to make sure if rice is present that there's not some sort of negative unintended side effect with that. And then the other invasives, things like carp, and those things can be an issue too. So yeah, invasives are an issue. And again, they're one of these things that are sort of a covariant with climate change, because it seems like the more the climate warms, the more competition from different invasives you end up facing. You know, one of the benefits of being up in the North Hardy places is not everything can hack it there.
Okay, if we want to take your good advice and try the real wild rice, what's the best sustainable way to do that? By try, I think they mean harvest and
Harvesting it. So if you've never harvested rice, you could contact the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission and we do at least have a brochure that can help a little bit. It's great if you can find a mentor, someone who has some experience doing it. The regulations are very few. And one thing about harvesting rice, the way it is legal to do today with the ricing sticks and such, is it's a pretty inefficient technique. And that's part of its beauty in a way, that even where areas are sort of intensively hand harvested that way, it leaves a lot of seed for the other beings that rely upon it and to reseed that bed itself. And so as long as you're not in the bed too early and you're not hitting the plant so hard that you're breaking stems and that kind of thing, you don't have to worry too much. But it really is helpful to find a mentor, because there are a lot of subtleties involved, and you'll certainly have more success if you've gone out with someone who can share some of those subtleties with you.
All right, I am getting messages in all capital letters from the producer saying we've got to wrap it up. We're going to continue the conversation, folks. There's so many good questions. We're going to continue in the Wonder Room, but let's get Kathy back and give some closing words. Thank you so much for this, Peter. And
it was great.
We'll get you in, Kathleen.
Our understanding of the natural world is sophisticated and comprehensive. The natural world is referred to as the environment and is not viewed as separate, but interconnected aspect of a whole. This interconnection shows us our stewardship and to live in harmony with respect to the natural world. As our plant nations and animal nations are resting, we think about our work ahead of us with field season coming soon and projects ahead of us. We must show much gratitude and ask permission in our own way to continue our reciprocal relationship to the land. With all the great knowledge holders and the great keynote speakers, this conference is a great basis in the virtual world to continue the stories of the wetlands, what they could tell us so we can have a better understanding of the natural world around us. The work we do, we must continue to gather the knowledge from the knowledge holders and modern science to draw from so we can continue to have our gifts for future generations. Just remember, we are here to get our teachings from the knowledge of great mentors along our journey. For example, such as P. David as himself, with his mentorship as he gets ready to get in his jaman, his canoe, and paddle on in a good way to his retirement soon. His knowledge that he shares for Manoomin and his stewardship to the land is the knowledge that his great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents had gifted him. And the knowledge that he shares now will affect his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. That knowledge is carried on through 7 generations. With knowledge holders such as himself, to pass on that knowledge is a gift himself. Nimigwich Wyndham to Peter and all the work that he does as he gets ready to transition, and that work that he passes on will continue on in a good way. May we all live life in a good way and continue our stewardship to Mama Key and continue this work through partnerships, collaborations, and through mentorships. Miigwech to all the organizers that went through this great effort to bringing us all together. And Gitchi Miigwech to Emily, Tracy, and Katie for facilitating and all the sponsors. It was a great honor to share the space with you all. Meet you.